The clock had long passed midnight, but Margaret Turner couldn't sleep. The house was quiet in a way that made her uneasy, a heavy silence that pressed against her chest as she stood by the kitchen window holding a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the small Ohio street was deserted, the lamplights casting soft pools of light over empty sidewalks and parked cars, yet Margaret felt her heart race as if the darkness itself were hiding something. Her son, Daniel, was never this late. At 22, he was supposed to be responsible, careful, predictable, the kind of young man who called when he'd be late or texted if something came up, but tonight, there had been nothing. Her mind raced with all the possibilities that a mother tries not to imagine, nothing dangerous, she told herself, but still, what could keep him out this long? Memories of Daniel's childhood flashed in her mind, him rushing home from school with stories spilling out in bursts of excitement, the way he had once pressed a muddy soccer ball into her hands and demanded she listen, how his eyes always held a little spark that made even ordinary days feel like an adventure. But lately, those stories had dwindled, his texts were short, his smiles a little forced, and he had grown distant in a way Margaret couldn't ignore. She wrapped her hands around her mug and let the warmth seep in, trying to calm the gnawing anxiety that had settled in her chest. Each passing minute felt like an hour. She imagined Daniel at a friend's house, perhaps studying late, or maybe caught in a traffic jam, or simply lost in thought somewhere she couldn't reach him. Still, every rational thought was swallowed by worry. Her phone lay on the counter, glowing softly with unread notifications, but there was nothing from him. She felt that strange mixture of fear and hope that comes when someone you love is late, and the night stretches on with possibilities too many and too uncertain to name. Margaret paced the kitchen floor once, twice, then paused, pressing her palm against the cool window. The air smelled faintly of rain from earlier that evening, the kind of smell that brings memories rushing back, memories of when Daniel was small and the world seemed infinite and safe because he was in it. She remembered tucking him into bed after nightmares, the way he had clutched her hand tightly, promising he would never leave, never wander too far, a promise now tested by years and growing independence. As she stared at the empty street, she felt a sudden pang of realization. He was no longer the boy who ran to her with everything in his heart, he was becoming a man with secrets and feelings she might not yet know. Her thoughts tumbled faster. What if he had met someone who pulled him away from home, even for just one night? What if he was struggling with choices she couldn't help him with? The minutes stretched, and with them came a soft ache, the kind that mothers feel when their children begin to live their own lives, when the house grows quiet not because all is calm, but because someone they love is somewhere else, building a world she can't fully see. She tried to tell herself that waiting was pointless, that worrying solved nothing, yet she couldn't stop. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her heart jump, and she clutched the counter as she turned. Headlights cut across the living room walls, spilling light into corners that had been dark all evening. The sound of the door opening, the faint echo of footsteps on the hardwood floor, made her muscles tense, ready to run, to hug, to scold, to question, all at once. She had no idea what Daniel would say, what he had done, or who he might have met. And yet, in that instant, she felt a flutter of relief mingled with apprehension, knowing that life was about to shift, quietly but irrevocably, with the words he would speak the moment their eyes met. She realized then that some nights carry more than darkness, they carry change, and sometimes, the most ordinary-looking night can mark the beginning of something that reshapes everything: trust, love, understanding, and the fragile, unspoken bond between a mother and her grown child. Margaret stayed frozen for a moment, her heart hammering, as the doorknob turned and Daniel stepped inside. He looked different somehow, not just older, but carrying an unspoken weight in his posture, the kind of weight only the heart can know. His jacket was rumpled, hair mussed, and his eyes carried the restless spark of someone who had been thinking deeply, feeling strongly, and now, perhaps, standing on the edge of a choice too big to explain in a single night. Margaret swallowed, her own emotions catching in her throat: relief, fear, curiosity, a subtle, bittersweet ache of knowing her son was leaving childhood behind and stepping into the messy, beautiful uncertainty of the adult world. She opened her mouth to speak, unsure whether to scold him for being late, ask questions, or simply hold him close. The words faltered, as they often do when the heart speaks faster than the mind. And then, as Daniel looked up, her eyes met his, and she saw a mixture of relief, hesitation, and something she couldn't yet name, something that promised that tonight, their lives would change in ways neither of them could fully predict. She felt speechless, waiting, knowing that whatever he said next would leave her stunned, her heart aching and swelling at the same time. The night outside remained quiet, the streetlights steady, and yet inside the small kitchen, time seemed to pause as mother and son faced the quiet before the storm of words, before confessions, before revelations that could redefine love, longing, and the fragile, tender bond between them. Margaret's mug had long since gone cold, but her hands remained wrapped around it as though it were the only anchor to the world outside the anticipation, and in that quiet, she realized that some moments are measured not by minutes or hours but by the weight of what is about to be said. And just as she thought she might finally breathe, Daniel took a step closer, and the story of late nights, hearts, and truths, was ready to unfold. Daniel stepped into the warm kitchen, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than usual in the silence of the night, and Margaret felt a jolt of relief mixed with tension that she couldn't quite name. He looked different than she remembered, older, somehow heavier, carrying an invisible weight in the set of his shoulders and the look in his eyes, the kind of look that tells you someone has been wrestling with feelings too big to share. And as he leaned his jacket against the counter, his movements careful, almost hesitant, she noticed the small details she hadn't seen before, the way his hair had fallen messily over his forehead, the faint shadow under his eyes, the restless shifting of his hands as if he wanted to say something but didn't know where to start, and Margaret realized that this was no ordinary late-night return, no casual excuse about studying too late or losing track of time. There was something deeper tonight, something that would require patience, understanding, and an openness she wasn't sure she had yet, and yet her heart told her she did. "You're late," she said softly, keeping her voice steady even as her stomach tightened, a gentle reproach hidden beneath concern, and Daniel lifted his gaze, meeting her eyes with a mixture of guilt and relief, like a boy caught somewhere between childhood comfort and adult responsibility, and his response was calm but layered with emotion. "I know," he said quietly, "I didn't mean to worry you," and Margaret sensed the honesty in his words, the truth that no excuse could mask, and she felt her heartache a little, remembering the countless nights she had waited up for him when he was a boy, worried about scraped knees and lost homework, never imagining that the day would come when the stakes would feel larger, more complicated, filled with invisible pressures she could not control or protect against. Yet her maternal instinct compelled her to listen, to stay present, to absorb every nuance of his confession before it escaped. Daniel put his keys down on the counter, fingers brushing against the wood with a subtle tremble, and she noticed how he avoided looking directly at her, his gaze flicking to the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but her eyes, and she understood immediately that what he was about to say carried weight, a revelation that had made him pause, hesitate, and question whether saying it aloud would change everything. And then he finally spoke, voice low but deliberate. "I was with someone," he admitted. And Margaret's chest tightened, a combination of surprise, curiosity, and the quiet pang of recognition that her son's heart was expanding beyond the walls of their home, that he was exploring emotions and connections she could not fully guide him through. And the words carried a tenderness and vulnerability she hadn't expected, something intimate without being inappropriate, something deeply human. And Margaret felt a sudden lump form in her throat, a mother's instinctive response to seeing her child on the brink of something transformative. Daniel's eyes lifted to meet hers briefly, pleading for understanding even as he struggled to articulate what his heart demanded, and then he said the words that made time pause in the quiet kitchen, "Someone important." And Margaret felt a shiver of recognition, knowing that this someone was more than a casual friend, more than a fleeting attraction, but a person who had stirred feelings in him that he hadn't shared before, and her mind raced through scenarios, emotions, and possibilities, trying to hold on to composure while letting him find his own voice, while letting him claim his own experience. "I think I'm in love," he admitted next, and the words landed softly, almost painfully, in the space between them. As Margaret absorbed the magnitude of what he was saying, she knew love could be messy, unpredictable, and raw, but hearing it expressed by the child she had raised filled her with a bittersweet pride, because she understood that love was not always easy, and sometimes it required courage to speak, Especially at a time when the world seemed uncertain, when hearts could be fragile, when choices carried weight, and she felt herself holding back tears, swallowing them so he could feel safe, so he could continue, and she marveled at the quiet bravery it took for him to reveal so much in so few words. "That's not why you're shaking," she said gently, more to steady him than to accuse, and Daniel looked at her with wide, conflicted eyes, caught between relief and fear, and then the words came, soft, hesitant, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to her. "She's leaving," he said, "tomorrow morning," and Margaret's heart contracted at the sight of his vulnerability, at the weight he carried in revealing that the person who had stirred his deepest emotions would soon be gone, leaving him with the raw ache of anticipation, loss, and unspoken possibilities, and she instinctively reached for him, placing a hand lightly on his arm, feeling the tension and uncertainty radiating from him, wanting to soothe, wanting to guide, but also knowing that this was his journey, his first taste of love's fragility and intensity, something she could witness but not control. Daniel's voice trembled slightly as he spoke about Emily, the woman who had captured his heart, his words tumbling out in a careful rush, explaining how he had met her during a volunteer project at a local shelter, how her laughter had drawn him in, how her way of seeing the world had made him see it differently, more openly, more tenderly, and Margaret listened, absorbing every detail, feeling herself swept into his story, empathizing with the passion, the longing, and the quiet heartbreak. Because she knew what it meant to love someone fully, to care with all your heart, and to face the possibility of their absence. He told her that Emily had asked him not to wait, that she believed love should never be a cage, should never hold someone back from living fully, and as he spoke, Margaret felt a wave of understanding, remembering her own choices years ago, the compromises and safe paths she had taken, the times she had loved quietly but had let fear dictate her steps, and she realized that Daniel was standing at a crossroads that she herself had once faced, feeling everything at once, the exhilaration, the longing, the risk, and the bittersweet ache of possibility. Margaret's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence, the tension, the heartache, and the courage that pulsed through him, and she said nothing at first, because some truths need to be felt rather than spoken, because some confessions carry weight too heavy for immediate response, and because she understood that listening was the greatest gift she could offer in that moment. Daniel's voice lowered further, almost a whisper, and he admitted how he had never felt this way before, how Emily had awakened something in him that he hadn't known existed, and Margaret felt a surge of emotion she hadn't expected, not jealousy, not fear, but a tender, aching recognition of love's power to change a person overnight, to stretch hearts beyond familiar limits, and to leave those who watch in silent awe, speechless yet grateful to witness the unfolding. "I didn't know who else to tell," Daniel said finally, and Margaret felt the truth of his words pierce her heart, realizing that she had been that confidant, that safe harbor, and now, as he stood before her, vulnerable and honest, she felt a mix of pride, sorrow, and hope, knowing that this night, this simple return home, would mark the beginning of a transformation, not just for him but for their relationship, as the quiet kitchen became a sacred space of confession, emotion, and maternal love that needed no judgment, only presence, only listening. Margaret reached out, embracing him not as a child, not as someone she could shield, but as a young man standing on the edge of love and loss, excitement and heartbreak, a person learning the courage it takes to open your heart fully, and as they held each other, she felt a quiet strength in knowing that the bonds of love could stretch, could bend, could grow, and still remain unbroken, even in the face of uncertainty and impending departure. And in that moment, Daniel looked into her eyes and saw the reflection of his own emotions mirrored back, a silent understanding passing between them that some nights change everything, that words can shift hearts, and that love, in all its messy, beautiful complexity, must sometimes be spoken aloud, even when it leaves the listener breathless, speechless, and profoundly aware of the depth of human feeling that makes life, even for a brief moment, feel infinitely meaningful. Daniel sank into the living room chair, shoulders slumping as if the weight of his own words pressed him down, and Margaret stood quietly across from him, sensing the storm inside him, the whirlwind of feelings he hadn't yet fully named, feeling both awe and worry as she watched her son wrestle with the truth he had barely begun to reveal. He began speaking, hesitant at first, voice low and uneven, explaining that Emily, the woman he had fallen for so completely, was leaving the very next morning, and Margaret's chest tightened in a mixture of sadness and recognition, because she understood too well how love could arrive in the quietest moments and vanish before you had time to grasp it, how hearts could expand and ache simultaneously, and Daniel described every detail with raw honesty, how her smile had brightened the dull hours of his day, how her laughter lingered in his mind even when the world demanded focus on other things, how she had made him feel seen in a way that was almost frightening in its intensity, and yet she was leaving, and he felt powerless, torn between letting her go and wishing to hold her close, between respecting her wishes and confessing that he could not imagine a day without her presence. He told Margaret about the first time he had truly realized his feelings, how a simple conversation, a shared laugh over something small and mundane, had triggered an unexpected rush of emotion, a yearning he couldn't ignore, and how over weeks those feelings had grown quietly, steadily, until they were undeniable, until he could no longer pretend that he wasn't in love, and Margaret listened, sensing in his words the same hunger, the same trembling hope and fear she had known in her own life. Remembering her younger days, the choices she had made, the risks she had taken, or avoided, in love, and how she had sometimes longed for someone to truly see her the way Daniel described Emily seeing him. He admitted that he had tried to hide his feelings at first, unsure whether they were real, unsure if confessing would ruin the fragile connection they had, and Margaret recognized the familiar pattern of hearts testing each other, waiting for courage to catch up with emotion, and she felt her heart ache at the vulnerability, at the bravery required simply to speak the truth aloud. Daniel spoke about the conversations they had shared, small moments that felt ordinary but had transformed into significant memories in his mind, how each glance, each laugh, each shared silence had begun to carry weight, meaning, and anticipation, and now, as Emily prepared to leave, he felt the urgent need to act, to express the fullness of his heart, but he also feared rejection, the silence of unreciprocated feelings, the quiet heartbreak that comes when love cannot be returned in equal measure, and Margaret felt the tension tighten in her chest, because she knew that this moment, this night, was a turning point not just for Daniel, but for both of them, a night where lessons about love, courage, and emotional honesty would unfold, shaping who he would become. He paused, taking a deep breath, and Margaret reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm, feeling the heat and tension in his skin, the pulse of worry and hope that ran through him, and he continued, speaking of the clarity Emily had brought to his life, how she had made him feel unafraid to imagine a future filled with possibility, how her words, her laughter, her presence had taught him that love was not only about passion but also about patience, understanding, and the willingness to let someone go if that was what was right, and Margaret listened, caught in the rhythm of his emotions, recognizing that this was not just a young man's confession but a universal truth about the human heart, how it expands, contracts, and sometimes breaks, all in the pursuit of connection. Daniel confessed that he had spent hours over the past week trying to decide what to do, pacing, thinking, questioning, and that he had even considered staying silent, letting Emily leave without revealing his heart, but that idea felt hollow, empty, a betrayal to the honesty he now knew he owed to both himself and her, and Margaret felt a quiet swell of pride mixed with sadness, because she knew the weight of such decisions, the courage required to act on love without certainty of its outcome. The way vulnerability could feel like both risk and salvation. He described how Emily had inspired him to dream more freely, to feel more deeply, to take emotional risks he had never taken before, and Margaret remembered the same spark in herself when she had first dared to love, when the world seemed both terrifying and wondrous, and she realized that Daniel's heart, in its tenderness and fear, mirrored her own experiences long ago, that he was standing at the precipice of learning what it meant to fully live with passion and uncertainty. Daniel's voice faltered as he admitted his fear of losing her, of returning to the emptiness of ordinary life without the joy she had brought, the spark she had ignited in him, and Margaret felt the raw ache of empathy, understanding that love could be as painful as it was beautiful, that to care deeply was to expose oneself to potential heartbreak, and that sometimes the most loving act was to let go, to speak the truth and trust the rest to fate. Margaret moved closer, resting her hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the tension ease slightly as he leaned into the warmth of her presence, and he continued to recount the moments of quiet intimacy with Emily, walks in the park where conversations lingered longer than necessary, shared meals where laughter softened the edges of the day, Moments of stillness where he realized that words were not always needed to feel deeply connected, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, moved not by loss, but by the beauty of a heart learning to open fully, to accept vulnerability, and to embrace the fullness of emotion. Daniel admitted that he had tried to convince himself that missing her would be easier if he remained silent, but the truth clawed at him relentlessly, a persistent ache that demanded expression, and Margaret understood the struggle, knowing that love unspoken is heavy, and that sometimes the weight of keeping it inside can crush the spirit as surely as loss itself. He confessed, finally, that the idea of Emily leaving tomorrow was unbearable, that he feared the silence, the distance, the empty space that would follow, and Margaret felt the fragility of the moment, the tension between anticipation and inevitability, between courage and fear, and she held him, not as a child, not as someone she could control, but as a witness to the raw, tender courage of a young heart learning the boundaries of love. Daniel's eyes met hers with a mixture of desperation and hope, a silent plea for guidance, for reassurance, for the understanding that sometimes the right thing is not easy, and Margaret felt a rush of emotion, recalling her own youthful decisions, her own experiences of longing and heartbreak, and recognizing that her role now was not to shield him but to let him learn, to let him feel, to let him make choices that would shape his life and his understanding of love. She held his gaze as he spoke of the intensity of his feelings, of the way Emily had transformed ordinary moments into something extraordinary, and she realized that this night would stay with both of them forever, a memory of honesty, vulnerability, and the first lessons in the kind of love that asks you to risk everything even when the outcome is unknown. Daniel's voice shook as he concluded that he could not let her leave without speaking, without confessing the depth of his feelings, without laying bare his heart for her to see, and Margaret felt a mixture of awe and sadness, because she understood that this was what growing up meant, facing your heart, exposing your emotions, and learning that the truth, however painful or beautiful, is the only path to freedom. She reached out again, resting her hands on his, and he felt the reassurance, the unspoken message that she trusted him to act, that she believed in his courage, that she would be there, quietly witnessing, whatever the outcome, and in that moment, Daniel realized he was ready, that he could face the morning with honesty, that he could love fully even if it hurt, and Margaret, watching him, felt speechless, her heart swelling with pride and tenderness, knowing that the night had shifted something fundamental in both of them, that Daniel had crossed a threshold into a new understanding of love, loss, and emotional bravery, and that this conversation, these words, this quiet, tender exchange, would echo in their hearts forever, marking the beginning of a story about courage, longing, and the beautiful, sometimes painful truth of loving someone with all your heart. The morning light crept softly through the kitchen window, painting the room in warm gold, but Margaret Turner felt a tension in the air that made the familiar brightness feel almost charged, as if the house itself held its breath for what was about to unfold. Daniel moved with quiet determination, phone in hand, pacing the living room in a rhythm that matched the pulse of his heart, his eyes alight with the mixture of fear, hope, and longing that comes when love demands action, and Margaret watched him, understanding fully that this was a turning point, that the choice he made in the next hours could shape his heart for a lifetime, teaching lessons about honesty, courage, and the sometimes painful beauty of loving someone deeply. She didn't offer advice, didn't speak, because she knew that no words she could give would substitute for the experience he needed to live fully on his own, and that love, real love, was always a teacher demanding vulnerability, trust, and bravery, and she felt a swell of pride mixed with the bittersweet ache of letting go, realizing that parenting doesn't end with childhood, that sometimes it means watching someone you raised step into the world with a heart exposed, learning its rules, its risks, its joys, and its sorrows. Daniel stopped mid-step, staring at the phone as if it contained the map to his heart, and Margaret felt her chest tighten, imagining the conversation that was about to happen, imagining the words he would speak to Emily, words that could open doors or close them forever, and she thought of the quiet nights they had shared, the long talks in this same living room, the moments when he had trusted her with his fears, dreams, and little victories, and she realized that now, in this very moment, he was preparing to share with someone else the most sacred parts of himself, the parts that could not be hidden, the parts that demanded honesty even at the cost of vulnerability. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Margaret had seen countless times, the sign of internal struggle, the prelude to a decision, and she felt a pang of empathy, remembering her own youthful decisions, the risks she had taken, the choices she had hesitated over, and she understood that Daniel's heart was beating in tandem with the lessons life had yet to teach him about love, loss, and the unpredictable beauty of opening one's soul to another. Finally, he looked up, eyes meeting his mother's, and Margaret nodded slightly, a silent message of trust, encouragement, and quiet pride, and he understood that he had her support, not in words, but in presence, in love, in the steady assurance that she would witness him stepping into the unknown with courage and honesty. He slipped on his jacket, the fabric feeling heavier than usual, as if carrying the weight of the emotions he could no longer keep inside, and Margaret watched as he made his way to the door, each step measured, deliberate, charged with anticipation and the tremor of vulnerability, and she felt her own heart expand, remembering the nights she had waited for him as a child, the nights he had leaned on her in fear or excitement, the nights when the world outside seemed too big and confusing, and now, as he prepared to face the world of love with all its uncertainty, she recognized the same need for bravery, the same courage that comes when the heart refuses to remain silent. Daniel reached the door and paused, hand on the doorknob, taking a deep breath that Margaret could see in the rise and fall of his chest, and she felt a mix of pride, hope, and gentle worry, knowing that what came next could change everything for him, that the person waiting for him at the airport would determine whether his heart soared or broke, and that the lessons of vulnerability and honesty would remain with him, regardless of the outcome. He spoke softly, almost to himself, words that Margaret could barely hear but that carried the weight of determination. "I just need her to know how I feel," and in that simple sentence was the courage of someone who had fallen fully, deeply, and could not retreat from the truth of his own heart, and Margaret understood that this was the kind of bravery that life occasionally demands, the kind that tests the limits of courage and the depth of love, and she felt a swell of admiration for the man her son had become, for the willingness to risk everything for the possibility of love. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against his face, Margaret followed quietly to the porch, watching him pause to take in the moment, the light, the world that seemed suddenly alive with anticipation, and she realized that sometimes love demands action, even when the heart is fragile, even when the outcome is uncertain, and that Daniel, in this moment, embodied the rare courage of speaking truth, of letting love guide his steps, and of confronting the fear of rejection with hope in its place. The driveway stretched ahead, the familiar streets now a stage for the unfolding of a story bigger than either of them, and Margaret stood silently, witnessing the rhythm of anticipation, understanding that letting go sometimes means letting someone fly, even if the heart aches in the process, and that the gift of love is not in possession but in honesty, in presence, and in the willingness to face uncertainty with a heart open and unguarded. Daniel checked his phone one last time, sending a short message to Emily, the words carefully chosen yet filled with the full intensity of his emotion, and Margaret watched the subtle tremor in his hands, the deep inhale before he pressed send, the almost imperceptible quiver in his jaw as he released the message into the world, trusting fate and feeling the electric thrill of hope and vulnerability mingling in his chest, and she felt tears prick her eyes at the beauty of watching him claim his feelings so fully, so courageously. As he slid into the car, engine humming softly, Margaret lingered on the porch, imagining the journey ahead, imagining the words he would speak, imagining the tender moments that would follow, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a mother who had raised someone capable of deep love, capable of honesty, capable of stepping into the unknown with all the bravery his heart could summon, and she knew that this day, this morning, would stay with her forever as a reminder that love is sometimes messy, sometimes frightening, but always worth the risk when the heart is true. The car disappeared down the street, and Margaret remained on the porch a moment longer, breathing in the crisp air, the warmth of the sun, the quiet hum of life beginning anew, feeling a profound sense of peace mixed with the ache of absence, because she knew that love, real love, never guarantees an outcome, but it always leaves the heart changed, richer, more awake, and more willing to feel fully, and she smiled softly to herself, understanding finally that her son's late-night confession, his courage, and his willingness to follow his heart were gifts she would carry forever, reminders that love arrives unexpectedly, challenges us, reshapes us, and that the bravest act is always to come home with your truth, speak it, and let life unfold as it will, knowing that honesty, courage, and the openness of heart are what make love eternal in memory and meaning.